So remember again that your inquiry paper and your analysis paper are both examples of essays, but they're essays that are primarily written for an academic audience using academic sources and for a specific purpose. So in order to explain something, in order to analyze and argue about something in academic writing, you have to read in order to make an argument. You have to read in order to know how to analyze things. And these are things that you cannot learn in one class. These are not things that you can learn by simply asking your instructor or attending one lecture. These are things that you learn in the practice of constantly reading, constantly thinking, and constantly writing. Okay, maybe it's not constantly, but these are skills that you can only learn in practice by reading, by thinking, by writing. Think of writing as basically a technology for organizing your thinking because we think through language. We therefore to write is to practice organizing your thoughts on paper or on a screen. And if you don't want to think, then that's a problem because basically because writing rests on thinking. Writing is thinking, as this course title tells you. Writing is thinking, so you have to think, and nobody can teach you how to think. Like we can, like the readings I included in the reading list, these, think of them as models that you can emulate in your own writing. Whenever you are given something to read, don't just read it for the sake of like doing an assignment or something. Reading has to be active for it to have any sense at all. So when you're reading something, you don't just read it. You don't just accept what it's telling you. You have to question it. You have to think about it. You have to ask, why is the author doing this? How is it related to the main problem? How can I apply this in my own writing? What is the significance of this to my own writing, to my own experience, to my own practice, etc.? So when you're reading, you're also constantly using your mind. You're also constantly using your kokote, and that's the only thing. That's the only way that you can learn how to write effectively, by reading a lot and then thinking about what you're reading. And again, these are not things that you can learn immediately, but you learn it through time, through practice. Um, so let me move on from that and discuss some basics of composition that can maybe help you think about the craft of writing. Like composition is the craft of writing in the same way that you compose a photograph or you compose, I don't know, your PowerPoint slides. So there is also a craft to composition or the art of writing. I'm hoping that having an awareness of these concepts can make you more reflective and aware about what you're doing when you are writing something. What is rhetoric? So, the first thing that we consider when we're writing about composition or when we discuss composition is to remember that this is an exercise of rhetoric. So, what is rhetoric? It is a discipline that is concerned with effective communication. So, when we're talking about communication, of course, there are different media and different forms of communication. You have like oral communication, written communication, visual communication, etc. So rhetoric is basically about how to communicate effectively in your chosen medium. So in the context of this course, this subject, that medium is writing. So how do you write effectively? First, you have to consider the basic elements of a rhetorical situation. In order to design your composition effectively, you have to consider these things. So, the first thing is, what is the purpose of your written text? Like, what is the purpose of communication? Are you writing to inform? Are you writing to entertain or delight? Are you writing to, I don't know, get somebody's affection? So you have to be persuasive about it. Are you writing to persuade? Are you writing to criticize? So the first thing that you have to consider is, what is my purpose for writing? And that purpose cannot be, I'm writing in order to pass this course. That's not what you do in composition. In composition, you think about, okay, I'm writing this thing. What is my purpose? What is the purpose of this essay? For those of you who don't know, essay comes from the French verb essayer, which means to try, to attempt. So writing is an attempt to fulfill the purpose that you set out for yourself. And you have to think about this. What is my purpose in writing? You can't just like go through some assignment. You have to think. The basic purpose of the inquiry paper is to explain a problem and a way of understanding it. For the analysis paper, the basic purpose is to analyze a problem and then to persuade your audience that your proposed way of understanding the problem or your proposed way of solving the problem is appropriate, that it's the best possible way of understanding or solving that problem. For the analytical paper, your purpose there is to analyze something and then to persuade your audience that what you offer is worthy of being believed in or worthy of being done. If what you're doing is a call to action, then you have to convince your audience. So that's the first thing that you have to consider when you are faced with any rhetorical situation. Like, what is the purpose of this text that I'm supposed to write or this speech that I'm supposed to give? What is my purpose? Because then that would define all the other things that you choose in writing something. If your purpose is simply to delight, to entertain, then you have to choose things that would entertain your audience. Like, I don't know, make them laugh, make them cry, make them whatever. But if your purpose is to explain something or to critique something, then you're not trying to be funny there. You're trying to actually interrogate something to make the reader think twice, to make the reader question their own assumptions. So, first, what is the purpose of communication? Second, what is my audience like? An audience is usually specific. It's tied to a particular event. It's tied to a particular set of people. An audience is often definable, but in our age where we all have access to the internet and we can post anything that we want in various public platforms, the notion of audience becomes more complicated. That's why what we discussed in this class is publics. So these are, again, the audience that comes into being by virtue of being addressed, or the recipient of your message that comes into being, that becomes organized by virtue of being addressed by your writing. But since in this particular course you have a specific audience, i.e. me and your classmates, then you have to consider, okay, how do I write my text, my paper, my essay in a way that is accessible to, understandable to, persuasive to my audience, i.e. my instructor and my classmates. So, and for the purposes of this course, this subject, your audience is the class. And then other things you have to consider: the rhetorical situation, the author. So you can also think about these elements not only when you're writing, but also when you are reading a text. So when you're writing, you have to consider these things, but when you are reading a text, you also have to consider these things. So in relation to the author, you can ask questions like, okay, what is the background of this author? What is the authorial persona like? Or you can get this from the tone of the essay. Does the author want to sound approachable and relatable, or does the author want to communicate this impression of being an expert on their subject? So the author when you're reading a text, you have to also ask questions about the author in order to better understand why a text is written the way that it is. So, for example, if you're writing or if you're reading a historical essay, let's say, you have to ask, what are the qualifications of this author for writing this essay? Let's say the essay is a historical academic essay that's meant to educate you about a particular point in history, let's say the Marcos dictatorship. You're reading an essay, you have to ask, what are the qualifications of the author for educating me about this particular topic? Do they know a lot about their topic? Like, what is the source of their legitimacy as a purveyor or as a source of information about this topic? You also have to consider what could be the author's um, ideological affiliations or ideological commitments, because those would necessarily color the work. For me, a good self-reflexive work, like a work that is accountable, has to lay out its ideological commitments. And this doesn't have to be explicit, like the author doesn't have to proclaim that he's a Maoist or that he's a Leninist or whatever. You also, or that he's pro Duterte, mga ganyan. You don't have to, like, as an author, often they don't have to explain or proclaim that explicitly. But in reading the text, if you're attentive to what you are reading, you will get a sense of what is the ideological positioning or affiliation or political affiliation of the author, based on what sort of details they choose to include, which sort of authors they tend to cite or not cite. But these are things that you gain a better sense for when you've read enough, when you've learned enough, when you're educated about the subject. If you're ignorant about a particular subject, then it's hard to tell. That's why in the course of your studies in UP, you'll be asked to read a lot, because UP education recognizes that social problems are complicated. And we tend to forget that because social media discourse can be so basic and so simplistic, and you know, but social problems are complicated. And the more you know, the more you realize how difficult it is to stake simplistic positions on things, because there are a lot of things that you need to consider. But I am digressing again. So basically, in the basic elements of the rhetorical situation, you also have to consider the author's background in order to better understand whether the information that he is presenting to you is credible, is reliable, is worthy of being considered and believed in. Okay, so that's why a lot of academic writing, including academic blogs, they state the author's qualifications and institutional affiliations, so that you have a sense of, okay, where is this author coming from? And to what extent can I believe him or take his arguments for granted, considering that he might be biased? And bias is not a necessarily bad thing. Everyone is biased, whether we're conscious of it or not. Everyone is biased in a particular way because we grew up in a particular environment, in a particular class with particular beliefs. But as a writer, we have to be aware, self-aware of what our biases are. And we also have to try to be aware of what other people's biases are in order to make more nuanced judgments about things. So, basic elements of the rhetorical situation: purpose, audience, author, and setting. Like, what is the context of communication? That relates to the immediate purpose often. But let's say the setting is important to consider, because what you say in a formal speech situation, what you say in a conference, for example, in an academic conference, let's say you have a particular topic, workers' rights, let's say. What you say about workers' rights in a formal academic setting, in a conference about labor laws, for example, would not be the same things that you would say in a public talk where the purpose is to inform migrant workers about their labor rights. What you so that's also setting is actually also related to purpose and audience. So what is the setting of the communication? So how you speak in an academic setting would be different from the way that you speak about the same topic in a different setting that involves a different purpose or that involves a different set of audience. Setting also helps determine what level of language you use. So if the setting is very formal and academic, often you're expected to use academic diction, formal language, because that is the nature of the setting. But if you're writing for a student blog whose main readers would be your peers, or if you're writing in on Facebook and you want to convince people about your beliefs, your political position, you can't simply adopt a formal style of writing because that might alienate the potential publics for what you're writing for. Also, the nature of the medium is different. So setting could also be related to the notion of medium or platform. So if you write very formally, academically in a space like Twitter, it might take you 110 tweets before you are able to express what you want to say because of the nature of the platform and its constraints. So the setting, understanding the setting and analyzing elements of the setting that are involved in that setting, constraints. Those so understanding the setting and its particular constraints. I think constraints is a useful way of understanding the setting. Each setting comes with its own set of constraints and expectations. So if you understand the constraints and expectations of a particular setting, then you can tailor your communication appropriately. And often understanding the setting also demands an understanding of your audience in that setting and your purpose of communication within that setting. So these four elements you have to think about and consider before you communicate, before you compose your writing. So, main types of writing that you can do from, again, these are basic. Often they overlap. Often in a single essay, you can have all of these four present, but these are like basic forms or types of writing that are usually used when you compose anything. So the first one, first main type of writing or basic fundamental type of writing is narrative writing. So the purpose, and usually these types of writing are distinguished by their purpose, like what is it that they seek to accomplish. So narrative writing seeks to tell a story. How do you tell a story, or what makes a story? A story is basically an organization of events and other elements of narrative, such as characters, setting, dialogue, etc., in time. So to narrativize an event is to arrange its elements in time. That's the basic way of understanding the notion of story, that there is an innate relationship to time and often also to causality, how one thing leads to another. So there is again that relationship of temporality and causality, how one thing leads to another. So the main operation again of narrative is plotting, which is basically the way that you organize events. There are two basic types of plot. One is linear and one is non-linear. So linear writing is chronological writing. So beginning, middle, end. Start, middle, finish, mga ganyan. So it's basically the linear plotting organizes events in a chronological order from start to finish, from beginning to end. Non-linear writing does the not linear. So it's basically not linear. You arrange events through time in a way that doesn't follow a linear progression. So some common ways of organizing events in a non-linear way, in medias res or in the midst of things. So in medias res, often the story begins in the middle. So when you write a narrative, you often begin in the middle of the story. In medias res means in the midst of. So you have an event, you begin in the middle of the story, and then you go back to the past, like through a flashback, and then you proceed to the future. So if you imagine if this were a line in medias res, can I open Blackboard? Let me open whiteboard. So if you were to imagine linear plotting, it's basically that, right? You have the beginning, middle, end, and you arrange events in that linear manner. In medias res, begins in the middle and then goes back to the past and then proceeds to the future. Cyclical writing. Saya pala mag-Jamboard. Ngayon na ako nag-Jamboard for class. Cyclical writing, ayan, uh, relates events in a cyclical fashion. So, cycle. You all know what a cycle is. Often, cyclical narratives begin with a particular event here, and then they tell the story in a linear fashion, kind of, because this is still linear, you have a forward progress. But then often it ends where you began. So they're often cyclical writing makes use of strategies of repetition, ending where you began. And that is often used to make comments about how things repeat themselves, etc. So that's cyclical plotting. And then episodic writing doesn't have a clear arrangement through time. We're given episodes, and then the reader makes a connection between that. So a lot of hypertext writing, hyperlink writing actually works with episodic forms. This isn't making any sense anymore. But often what you're given are just a set of like vignettes or very vivid narrative episodes, and then the reader makes a connection between those things. Dinawin ko lang din ulit. So you're given vignettes or little stories with little vivid stories, and then the reader, it's not arranged in any clear temporal linear chronological way. It's not clear, but the reader makes the connections. And I personally enjoy episodic writing in fiction because it makes you think about what is this? Like you only understand the relationship between things after you've read everything and then reread it multiple times. So in fiction, episodic writing could be fun because it involves a mental puzzle, but in academic writing, please do not write episodically. Your goal in academic writing is to inform your reader about something, and please don't write episodically. Like the logical flow of events in your writing has to be clear. Okay, so let me exit Jamboard. So again, narrative is one basic form of writing. Another basic form of writing is descriptive writing. The purpose of descriptive writing is to make the reader imagine that which is being described, not only through adjectives, but through imagery and figurative language or figures of speech, such as a metaphor. So if the goal of narrative is to tell a story in a way that makes your reader understand how events are related to each other in terms of time and in terms of causality, in descriptive writing, your goal is to make the reader imagine what you are describing and to viscerally feel it through their imaginative senses. You make them want to see something, to hear something, to feel something, to hear something. So basically, you want your reader to experience various sensations of sight, sound, smell, touch, etc., but in an imaginative way. Like you're not actually stabbing your friend with an ice pick, but you want to make them imagine getting stabbed by an ice pick. So the main operation of descriptive writing is figuration, or the transmutation of ideas or abstractions into concrete images that evoke sensation, emotion, experience, or memory. So, for example, you have an abstraction like pain. Like, you know conceptually what pain means, but it's an abstraction. How do you concretize pain? How do you make your reader experience pain? You can write something like, you can describe something as not a piercing, red hot pain, but a soft, enveloping pain, like being swathed by a thick blanket but feeling cold. Pain like a breath caught between the chest and the throat. Pain like stepping out the door one summer noon, clad all in a coat in 40-degree weather or something. So if you notice in this passage, you have adjectives like piercing and red hot. Red hot in itself is an image because it makes you imagine the color red. So there are adjectives here: piercing, red hot, soft, and enveloping rather than piercing. So you have adjectives, but you also have figures of speech, such as this simile, like being swathed by a thick blanket but feeling cold. Or imagine pain like a breath caught between the chest and the throat, like when you're about to cry and there's something stuck in that space between the chest and the throat. Like imagine that sort of pain. So description can use adjectives, but it also relies more effectively on making your reader imagine concretely what it is that you are describing. So focus here on concreteness, on specificity. So in terms of academic writing, narrative and description can be used to engage the reader's interest, like to make them visualize or imagine, feel what it is that you are describing. So they're particularly effective in drawing your reader into a particular problem. But they're not like the bread and butter of academic writing, so to speak, because often these forms of writing, description and narrative, are more predominantly used in forms of creative writing. But in academic writing, kasi you want to explain something in a way that makes your reader understand easily what you are trying to say. So in academic writing, often there's more focus on efficiency, like communicating. So in imaginative writing, effective communication consists in being able to immerse your reader in the story, in the world that you are creating. So immersion is important. Making them feel emotion is important. So there's a lot of focus on narrative and description because you want your reader to experience something imaginatively. So that's what effective writing consists in creative writing and imaginative writing, when you're able to give your reader an experience. But in academic writing, kasi what you want to do is to explain things, to communicate information, to make an argument. So effective writing in academic writing is quite different in purpose and strategies than imaginative writing. So in the next two forms, basic forms of writing that we'll discuss are expository writing and persuasive writing. So exposition, the main purpose of exposition is to explain something. And in order to explain something, there are various strategies that you can use. Here in number 5, patterns of paragraph development, which I'll get to later. In persuasion or persuasive writing, your main purpose is to convince, especially when you're encountering opposition. So you don't need to convince somebody who already believes the same way that you do, but if you encounter somebody who has opposite opinions or have somebody who has conflicting opinions, then that's when persuasion also comes in. Like, how do I get this person who doesn't think the same way that I do? How can I get them to see things the way that I do? So exposition to explain, persuasion to convince, and usually these are the two things that are used in academic writing. So remember again that in Shore's Grad School Essentials, his way of of explaining academic writing rests on argumentation. You're making an argument about how to understand things, how to explain a problem, how to solve a problem. So that's why these two things are often used for academic writing. You can also, again, do narrative and description in academic writing, but they're more like techniques to get the reader's interest than the main forms of writing that you'll do. So when it comes to persuasion, I think these are things that you also studied in high school. The walang kamatayang logos pathos ethos. Logos is about the content of your argument, the argument that you're making, and the supporting details that you're using, such as evidence, theoretical justification. So logos is your logic, the logic of your argument, the content of the argument that you're making. Pathos is about how you present your argument in a way that has emotional interest, emotive interest. Pathos is not necessarily irrational, but it is a non-rational form of argumentation. That is, it doesn't really rely on making your reader, like, its way of convincing the reader is not just about throwing facts at the reader, because often this just throwing facts, throwing information, that's often not enough by itself to convince someone, especially someone who believes otherwise and has deep reasons for believing otherwise. So pathos is about evoking emotion in a way that makes your reader more amenable to or more open to seeing your point of view. And pathos is easier to gauge when you're napapaus na ako. Pathos is easier to gauge when you're doing a face-to-face interaction, because you can see how your audience is responding, and then you can tailor your message accordingly. But in writing, you can't see your audience. So you have to, again, go back to the basic elements of the rhetorical situation and then define these elements for yourself so that you can craft the pathos component of your writing in a way that appeals to your audience depending on the rhetorical situation. So pathos is about, again, communicating your message in a way that evokes emotional receptiveness in your reader. And it's important to consider that because human beings are not automatons. Like, human beings are not machines. Whether or not we like it, we have feelings. And sometimes what convinces us of somebody's position is not so much what they are saying, how reasonable their logic is, but about how they say it and how it captures us or not, or how it offends us or not. So depending on how you gauge your audience and your purpose, you can make your writing like gentle and agreeable and nice if it serves your purpose, or you want to make it shocking and offensive if you have a different purpose, if you want to like shock people into thinking. So it depends on what your purpose is and what your awareness of the audience is. For the purposes of this class, again, you don't need to be so emotional about your essays, because your goal here is to explain something and also to argue for something. Yeah, usually pathos becomes more important when you're arguing about an emotionally laden issue, because some issues are not emotionally laden. So for example, should we or should we not build parex which will go over the Pasig River? Often an issue like that involves looking at the stakeholders, and then making rational calculations about the cost and cost no the benefits and the cost benefit analysis, sorry. So sometimes some issues are not so emotionally laden, like you have to do Some issues demand a simple cost benefit analysis of who will benefit, in what ways will they benefit, what is the nature of the benefit, who will be damaged by this, who will be left out of this, mga ganon, cost benefit analysis. But some issues are emotionally laden issues. Like a lot of political issues are emotionally laden issues. So the way that you make timpla, kasi pagtitimpla talaga siya, the way you make timpla pathos in your essays depends on your awareness of the emotional heft or weight of the issue and the emotional attachments of your audience. So again, depende pa rin yan on how you understand your audience and your purpose in communicating. So logos, pathos, ethos. Ethos is about it's usually translated as ethics, but ethos is about the author's or the speaker's credibility. Like ethos, if you're thinking of pagtitimpla again, ethos is about crafting your message in a way that communicates the credibility of the speaker. So in academic writing, to build the ethos component of your writing, you have to come across as somebody that's credible, that's worthy of being believed in. How do you do that? In various ways in your writing. So, for example, did you proofread your work to eliminate grammatical errors and typographical errors? Because if you do that, you're communicating that, hey, I'm a person who pays attention to details. I'm a person who cares about presenting work that has been carefully attended to. Mga ganon, parang attention, when you proofread your work for mistakes, you are communicating to your reader that I pay attention to details, that I try not to make mistakes, that I care about my reader enough to make the flow of my writing easy to understand for them. Mga ganon. That's part of ethos. When you cite your sources properly, you are telling your reader, I have done my due diligence. I have actually read a lot about this topic. And not only have I read a lot about this topic, I have the sense of responsibility to cite the sources of my information, because I know that when I cite the sources of information, I am also being accountable to my reader. Like, I don't just make tap on all of these facts. Like, I just don't throw around information. I am also empowering my reader to check the information that I am giving them and to help them find that information if they want to learn more about it for themselves. So these practices that we've been studying in class, these are not just things that we are doing because wala lang. They're all communicating something specific to what we're trying to achieve as intellectuals, as scholars, as researchers. We want to communicate that we do our due diligence, we are responsible, we are accountable, we care about what we say. So parang when you get back your work tapos ang daming corrections, ganyan, minsan nakakainis siya kasi parang ano ba to, ang hassle naman gawin, parang ang hassle naman i-correct. But there is an underlying significance to these practices that keep us accountable and responsible for the things that we write. Hindi lang siya sasabihin lang tapos wala lang. Their writing, especially writing for a public, demands responsibility and accountability. And when we pay attention to these practices of citation, of proofreading, of organization in our writing, we are being accountable to the things that we write and say. And that is part of academic freedom, being accountable. That is part of the freedom of speech, being accountable also to that which we say. So these freedoms, again, these are not just freedoms, like doing whatever you want. These rights also demand responsibilities. And what we're learning in this class is also how to be a responsible academic, a responsible researcher, a responsible scholar. Lastly, patterns of paragraph development. that we can use in our own writing. Um, so definition, classification, these are just things that you can do when you are writing, basic patterns of paragraph development. So definition, classification, comparison and contrast, cause and effect or causal analysis, process analysis, and evaluation. So definition can be, let me edit this, ha, uh, can be denotative, dative, connotative, can also be etymological. So denotation is about the dictionary definition of a term. Or if you have other sources of meaning rather than just a dictionary, a denotation can also be when you cite a particular author's definition of a thing. That is also an example of a denotation. The goal of definition is to define something. What does it mean to define something? To make the boundaries of the thing sharp and definite. So when we say that something is epic, ganyan, to define something as epic is to limit the application of this word. To define something is to limit its application. So that when you have a word like heteronormativity, ganyan, to define heteronormativity is to limit the application of this word, so that when you say that a cat meowing is heteronormative. For example, your sentence is, that meowing cat is so heteronormative. It doesn't make sense, diba? It doesn't make sense because that's not the definition of what heteronormative is. Or when you use a word like capitalism, lahat na ng capitalism, parang pag, let's say you have a sentence like, I gave my neighbor a basket of eggs in return for a basket of squash. I'm so capitalist. That sentence also doesn't make sense because that is not the definition of capitalism. So, definition is about limiting the application of a word. And you can do that in various ways. One is giving the denotation of the word. So, denotation is usually related to the dictionary definition or a technical definition of something. So, a technical definition that is found in some other writing, or a book that sets standards for the meanings of things. So that's usually what is involved in denotation. So if you can find that definition in something like a dictionary or a textbook or any other authoritative reference work, that could be an example of a denotation. So let's say you want to define futures in the context of financial capitalism. You want to define derivatives and futures in the context of financial capitalism. Then you find the book on financial capitalism and look at how it defines derivatives and futures. So these are examples of denotation. Connotation is about the nuances that attend a word that are not captured by the dictionary definition. So the connotation or connotative definition recognizes that the meaning of a word is also the sum of its uses in various situations. So, for instance, one of you wrote about how capitalism has a bad connotation. So, the meaning of capitalism has a bad, so-called bad connotation or bad nuance because of the ways in which it is often used. So you have to define the situations in which it is often used. How exactly does it have a bad connotation? So connotation usually, again, depends on the usual ways in which a particular word is used and the emotional resonances or meanings that come to attach itself to that word. So an example or an exercise that I like to do when I talk about connotation is to ask the question, how would you define or describe or explain the color red to somebody who has been blind since birth? So again, How do you define or describe the color red to somebody who has been blind since birth? So answering that question demands like thinking about the usual connotations of the word and the color red, or how is it usually used? So usually when we say red, some of the things that people would say in relation to this word would be sin, because apple, because story of Adam and Eve. So red as sin because it's also connected to that story of the apple and Adam and Eve and temptation, etc. So words that are usually used in relation to red: passion, triumph, danger, sin, temptation, what else? Love, because of the heart thing. Mga ganyan, blood, pain. So all of these things are connotations of the word red that exceed its denotation or its technical or dictionary definition. So that's another way that you can define something. Etymological definition usually involves etymology is about the origin of a word. So etymological definitions often operate by looking at the origins of the word in order to explain or understand the word better. So it again, etymological analysis relates to the origin and the development of a word. So again, definition is about limiting a word's application by clearly stating its meaning. Okay. And then you can do that by denotation, connotation, or etymology. Ganyan. Classification explains something by dividing it into categories and then classifying objects into categories. So classification usually goes hand in hand with division and classification. Let me open a whiteboard again. So division and classification. Division is about dividing your object of analysis into categories, and classification is about arranging objects into various categories. So for example, you have a subject like gender. In a heteronormative context, gender is usually, so you have, let's say, gender. In a heteronormative context, which strives on binarism in relation to gender, you usually have two genders. Again, this is under a heteronormative meaning system. You have the feminine gender and the masculine gender. So the process of dividing a category or a concept into subcategories is division. So feminine and masculine. When you divide something, usually you have a principle for division. And in a heteronormative context, the principle of division for what is feminine and what is masculine in terms of gender depends on your sex. On sex, which relates to what sort of organ you have. Is it a penis or is it a vagina? So usually, if you have a vagina, you're expected to be feminine in a heteronormative cisgender context. If you have a penis, you're expected to be masculine. So that's the principle of division. What sort of organ you have usually, and again, this is in a heteronormative context. So division is the process of dividing a concept into categories, and classification is the process of arranging objects or organizing objects according to their specific category or classification. So for instance, let's say your categories are feminine and masculine, and then you have an object like skirt, high heels, stockings, ganyan. Usually, you have skirt, high heels, stockings. Parang skirt. Yan, skirt, high heels, stockings. If you have objects like this, usually where would you put them? In the feminine box or the masculine box? Usually in a heteronormative setting, again, that would be put in a feminine box. If you have lipstick, eyeshadow, These objects usually would be, or if you have patient, nurturing, caring, pretty. So these words would also be usually associated with the feminine. If you have aggressive, strong, what else are usually masculine characteristics? Aggressive, strong, violent, ganun talaga. Caring also, I guess, because you're a breadwinner, nga ganyan. Usually these will be classified as masculine. So basically, division and classification is about coming up with categories and then arranging objects into those categories. So that is what you do in division and classification. Another thing that you can do in division and classification is to have like a is to divide something into constituent factors or constituent parts. Instead of dividing something into categories or types, another thing that you can do in division and classification is dividing a concept into its constituent parts. So, for example, if you've heard of the IPAT equation in calculating impact, so impact, ecological impact, that's what I is for, is usually calculated by looking at the relationships between population, affluence, or yung wealth, consumer ability, ganyan, population, affluence, and technological innovation. So usually the impact, ecological impact of something, let's say a country, is calculated based on its population, the number of people within it, its affluence or the ability of these people to buy things, and technological innovations, for example, green technologies that also help mitigate impacts. So this is also another example of division and classification, whereby you understand something by understanding or laying out its constituent elements and how they relate to one another. So comparison and contrast is about comparing and contrasting things. So comparison focuses on similarities, contrast focuses on the dissimilarities or differences between things. But in order to do this comparison and contrasting of things, there has to be a basis for comparing on and contrasting the elements that you are comparing. So when you write something comparing two situations, for example, or two people, you have to also explain why you are comparing these two, or these three, or these four, why you are comparing these objects or people and not others. So comparison and contrast. Cause and effect or causal analysis looks at, as the name says, how something comes to be, and what are the factors that led to it. So causal analysis. How a result, what are the factors that led to a particular result? That's the usual question for a causal analysis, or looking at causes and effects. So in your own writing, you can focus on the causes of some things. For example, you have a problem. Let's say you have a problem like the drug war on drugs, ganyan. You can explain this problem by examining its causes, or you can explain this problem by examining its effects, or you can do both. So these are ways of explaining a particular subject, doing a causal analysis by focusing on the causes, by focusing on the effects, or by doing both. And in doing cause and analysis, you can also distinguish between immediate and eventual causes and effects. So these are organized in relation to time. So what are the immediate effects? What are the eventual effects? Or things that will happen further on down the line. So you can focus on immediate causes and effects or remote causes and effects. Let's say you want to write about difficulties and remote learning. So what is the cause of this problem? Let's say one of the causes, one immediate cause that you identify is the technological gap. by which some people have the know-how and the devices to participate in remote learning, while some people don't have the devices or the know-how to participate in remote learning. So that is an immediate cause of difficulty in remote learning. But underlying that immediate cause are other older causes. So difficulty in remote learning. So one cause of that, one immediate cause of that would be the technological gap, whereby you have a difference in you have the haves and have nots problem when it comes to devices and technological know-how. But underlying that problem of the technological gap is also an educational gap, a because some people are taught how to have like literacy with these devices, and some people don't have that kind of literacy when it comes to handling that devices. So the technological gap is also caused by educational, or let's say just literacy literacy and um, material gaps, resource gaps, literacy and resource gaps. But even this gap in literacy and resources is caused by an underlying problem, which would be which is related to economic inequality. So when you're doing this kind of thinking about what is the immediate cause and what is the remote cause, or what is the immediate effect and what is the remote effect, you go back in time or you go forward in time, and you ask questions like, okay, there's a problem, why is there that problem? And you have a problem, you can ask, what caused this problem? What is the cause of this cause? What is the cause of this cause of this cause? Mga ganyan. I think in high school you're taught like the herringbone exercise for plotting immediate and remote causes. But the basic point is that in your essays, you can help explain something. You can explain something by looking at its causes and effects. And if you want to elaborate further on causes and effects, you can make these analysis of immediate causes versus remote causes. Another thing that you can consider when doing causal analysis is to make a distinction between sufficient causes, necessary causes, and contributing cause or contributing factors, contributing cause. So a sufficient cause, as the name indicates, is sufficient by itself to create a particular result. A necessary cause must be there in order for a particular result or effect to come into being, but by itself is not enough to create that particular effect. A contributing cause contributes to that particular result, but by itself is not enough to create that result or that effect. So when you're doing causal analysis, you can also make these distinctions between what is a sufficient cause, what is a necessary cause, what is a contributing cause. So all of these things that I'm telling you today, these are just ways or mental tools that you can keep in your mental toolbox for thinking about things and writing about things. So think of it in that way. Um, if you're aware of these things, you might be able to more specifically think about the problems that you're grappling with. So cause and effect, causal analysis. And then process analysis is about cause and effect, and process analysis are also usually related to narrative as a form of writing, because you're kind of telling a story about how something came to be or what would happen as a result of something. So causal analysis and process analysis are both telling a story. So cause and effect are concerned with, as I said, causes and effects. Process analysis is concerned with what happens in between a cause and an effect. So the how did the cause come to create a particular effect. The how part, the middle part, is what process analysis is concerned with. So usually in explanatory essays, causal analysis and process analysis are used together, because if you just look at the causes or just at the effects, there's kind of a missing part of that story. And the process analysis helps explain what processes led to a cause creating a particular effects. Ganon. So causal analysis. Evaluation involves a normative judgment. Normative meaning relating to norms, or what is good or bad, what is valuable and worthless, what is possible and impossible, what is appropriate and not appropriate. So in evaluation, when you develop an idea, in order to evaluate it, you lay out your means of evaluating something, your rubrics, your criteria for evaluating something, and then you make an evaluation in evaluative analysis. So evaluation sometimes is also used in tandem with division and classification if you're laying out your criteria for evaluating something. So these are all examples of how you can analyze or break something down and think about it. So analysis is again is about understanding something by breaking it down into its constituent elements. And there are various ways of breaking it down, and I have laid out these ways of breaking it down.